Hey, this is Ramon, Channel Alpha 4, and welcome to my Bible study series. This is, actually, it doesn't actually have a title, I just realized that. All my other stuff has a title. This one's from before I was putting titles on stuff. Anyway, this is chapter 31 of Genesis, and this is going to be, it's time for Jacob to leave and return home. First, for the summary. The sons of Laban grew jealous of Jacob's success. So the Lord tells Jacob to return home. So Jacob gathers his wives and tells them his reasons for wanting to flee, and tries to convince them to come with him. But they need no convincing. Their father is in decline, and they have no real reason left to stay. Rachel steals her father's household gods, and Jacob packed what was his and fled without a word. Laban and his were ready to pursue, but God intervened and told Laban to be careful, not to say anything positive or negative to Jacob. My read on this command is that it was given so as not to give Jacob or his wives an excuse to stay for one reason or another, rather out of fear or loyalty to Laban. Laban catches up to Jacob and accuses Jacob of foolishness. But he is careful with his words, and instead of taking any action, asks why in the world would he take his gods? Jacob answers unaware of the implications that anyone among his band with his father-in-law's gods will die. Rachel hid her father's gods by sitting on them and saying that she was on her period. This was a type of ancient literary disrespect, saying that the Amarian gods, the Amarian idols, were unclean. Jacob then, unjustly vindicated, lets loose his resentment for years of mistreatment by Laban. Going over item by item the terms of his dealings with Laban. At the watch post between the two camps, Laban and Jacob make a covenant. As all that was Jacob's was still rightfully Laban's. They agree to terms. Jacob could not remarry another. He must treat both his wives, the daughters of Laban, well, and he could not return with the intent to harm Laban or in search of vengeance for the wrongs Laban had done to him. So they broke bread, shared wine, and agreed. So Laban got to say goodbye to his daughters, and then he returned home. The one question I have here that I have not been able to find a convincing answer to is why does Rachel take the false gods with her? What does this explain in the narrative or to the original intended audience? Alright, so now let's go over the notes. So let's start off with verse 1. And today's reading is going to be out of the ESV. So anybody who likes the ESV, today's your day. Now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has gained all this wealth. This is the only place that Laban's sons are mentioned, and it echoes Esau's words. Then let's move on to verse 4 of chapter 31. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the field where his flock was, and said to them, I see that your father does not regard me with favor as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not permit him to harm me. If he said, the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. And if he said, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock bore striped. Thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. In the breeding season of the flock, I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and molted. For I have seen all. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob. And I said, Here I am. And he said, Lift up your eyes and see. All the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, and molted. For I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. So, it's important to note that this is a completely different account of the method of flock increase than was in Genesis chapter 3, verses 25 through 43. Also, verses 5 through 13 are from author E. That's important to note because there are actually two authors in this chapter. The other is J, and he will run through most of 14 through 16. And they will eventually blend later on in this chapter. So let's read 14 through 16. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, Is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do. Rachel and Leah seem to have found peace between each other and concord with their husband in concern for their family's well-being. Also, it's important to note that 14 through 16 is from author J. If we jump to verse 19, you will see something odd. Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. That's weird, and it's hard to find an explanation for that. Rachel may have taken her father's gods as a type of bride price owed her, which was a piece of the dowry reserved for her for after her father's death as part of her inheritance. Or, the other explanation that I found is that possession of ancestral deities meant leadership of the family and was a way to legitimize property claims. But neither of these answers truly satisfied me. Now let's jump into verses 20 through 22. Jacob tricked Laban, the Aramean, by not telling him that he intended to flee. He fled with all that he had, and arose and crossed the Euphrates, and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. Now, it's interesting that the line that you'll see here is either in the Hebrew will be read as to still the mind of, or in the Greek is to still the heart of. And basically, calling Laban an Aramean was anachronistic. The Aramaic, I can't pronounce that correctly, was a later culture and language in antiquity. The Arameans in this chapter were most likely the Nahor. Okay, now let's move on to 23 through 25. When it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsman with him and pursued him for 7 days and followed close after him into the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. If we jump back to verse 17, you will see that it says, So Jacob arose and set his sons and his wives on camels. That's an important note because camels, again, are an anachronistic reference. And as for the 7 days' journey, this is actually an underestimation of the distance between Haran and Gilead. Now let's move on to verses 26 through 28. And Laban said to Jacob, What have you done, that you have tricked me and driven away my daughters like captives by the sword? Why did you flee secretly and trick me, and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs, with tambourine and lyre? And why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly. It's clear here from this verse that Laban viewed Jacob sneaking off with his wives as an act of war, and them, his daughters, as prisoners of war, and the flocks Jacob took with him as the spoils of war, or of the spoils of a raid. They were war booty in Laban's eyes. Okay, now let's check out verses 29 through 30. This chapter actually had a lot more to it than I thought it did when I did my first read-through. It is in my power to do you harm, but the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And now you have gone away, because you longed greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? Laban actually has a bigger problem here, because he did not believe in the very one who appeared to him in his own dream to warn him not to say anything positive or negative to Jacob. So that is actually a very interesting conundrum. Laban gets a vision from a God he doesn't believe in, and still doesn't believe in even after following that God's advice. That he doesn't believe in the one whose advice he is following. 31 to 32. Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters away from me by force. Anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. In the presence of your kinsmen, point out what I have that is yours, and take it. Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. So Laban went into Jacob's tent, and into Leah's tent, and into the tent of the 2 female servants, but he did not find them. And he went out to Leah's tent, and entered Rachel's. Now Rachel had taken the household gods, and put them in the camel's saddle, and sat on them. Laban felt all about the tent, but did not find them. And she said to her father, let not my lord be angry, that I cannot rise before you, for the way of a woman is upon me. So he searched, but did not find the household gods. It's interesting here for 2 notes. One is a question that this leads me to think about, which is, were the uncleanliness and purity laws of the Arameans the same as it was for the pre-Israelites, and were the rules for the pre-Israelites the same as for the later Hebrewic Jews? But yet again, Rachel deceives her father. I say yet again because in some of the commentaries it says this is a second deception, although I don't quite remember there being a first. Rachel sits on the idols, claiming she was menstruating, is wordplay. Here, it is a way to imply that the idols are impure. And so this would be kind of an insult to any Arameans who would hear this story. And a way to tell the listeners not to worship the Aramean idols that they would come across, or the Aramean gods that they would come across during their conflict with the Arameans. Okay, and let's continue on to 39. Verse 39. What was torn by wild beast I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. From my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. Jacob went beyond the duty due his father-in-law by replacing a sheep lost by animal attack, according to ancient Near Eastern standards at that time. In the Hammurabi Code, Laban would have been expected to take the loss of the sheep or lamb in stride if it was due to an animal attack, with no penalty due the tending shepherd. Okay, and then we get to verse 44. Come now, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. This place could also be translated as refuge. This is a non-aggression pact and a defining of territory. Let's move on to 46 through 47. And Jacob said to his kinsmen, gather stones. And they took stones and made a heap. And they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Jegar Sahadutha, but Jacob called it Gilead. So these two pillars they put up are sometimes referred to as living stones, and they can represent the pillars of faith in some Christian denominations, and also in some Judaic denominations. Is Reform Judaism a denomination of Judaism, or is it another branch? I don't know. Someone answer that for me. These verses are the folk origin for Gilead, and this story concerns a later dispute between the Israelites and the Arameans from about the 9th century, which can be read about in 1 Kings chapter 22 verses 1 through 38 and 2 Kings chapter 9 verses 14 through 15. But this mending metaphor goes further than referencing future events. It is also a meta-textual reference to the two textual sources being blended from here forward. So E and J will now become one source going forward from this. So that's actually interesting and kind of cool. All right, so let's move on to 47. It's also important to note that there are two languages being spoken here, Ancient Hebrew and Aramean. Okay, I'm getting better at pronouncing that word. Now let's move on to verse 52. This heap is a witness, and the pillar is a witness, that I will not pass over this heap to you, and you will not pass over this heap, and this pillar to me, to do harm. And here's where we get the idea that these were probably the Nahor. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. So there you go. The fear of Isaac is actually an archaic title for God the Father. Verse 55. Early in the morning, Laban arose and kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned home. Now, this last bit is important because if you notice, Laban does not kiss Jacob. And this is actually an ancient type of disrespect and a sign of hostility between them. And the kisses in ancient times are kind of more like the Hispanic kisses, which is either a kiss on the cheek or a soft kiss on the lips. That's kind of like how Hispanic people say hello and people from more Mediterranean cultures say hello. That's where that comes from. All right. Peace, like, and subscribe. Next week, new Bible and chapter 32. Please comment down below. This is going to take some editing. Talk to you all later. Bye. These are not words I say every day, people. Sorry. So the pronunciation is just a little off and a little hard on the tongue.